The drill reached bedrock at 17 minutes past 4 in the morning, and that was the exact moment the ground started talking back. Nobody on the excavation platform believed it at first. The seismic techs thought it was feedback. The site foreman thought it was a busted relay. Then every comm channel on Solace, civilian and assembly alike, filled at once with a voice that hadn't been heard in 90 years, cracked, dragged up through 3 meters of red clay and a marker stone nobody had ever managed to open. "Don't move him," I gave my word. Then nothing, just the low hiss of a battery that had been dying for 9 decades and had finally given out. For 6 full seconds, nobody on that platform moved. Then the ground shook again, harder this time, and something answered from underneath a hill that had no business answering anything at all. None of that would happen for another 9 weeks. 9 weeks earlier, nobody on Solace had any reason to think a graveyard could be dangerous. Morel Okafor had grown up walking between the headstones, the way other children walked to school, and she still came out every morning before the twin suns cleared the ridge, dragging a rake she didn't strictly need anymore, because the ground on Solace didn't grow weeds so much as it grew things that wanted to eat you, and someone had to keep them off the graves. She was 34 years old, the 4th generation of her family to hold the title nobody had ever bothered to make official. Groundskeeper, archivist, the person who remembered names the colony's own records had stopped bothering to store. There were 211 graves on the low hill above the colony, going back 90 years to the crash that had put humanity on this planet in the first place, back when Solace hadn't even had that name yet. Back when it was just an unmarked rock that had torn the colony ship Meridian in half on its way down. The first grave sat at the top of the hill, alone, with a stone marker nobody had carved with tools, because there hadn't been tools left to carve it with. Just an inscription scratched by hand. First, he stayed. Nobody in the colony's official records could say who he was. Nobody could say why the stone had a strange spiral pattern worn into its base that looked deliberate, not weathered. Nobody could explain why, in 90 years of settling one of the most hostile planets in the surveyed galaxy, nothing dangerous had ever come down off that ridge at night. Morel's grandmother used to say, "The hill watched itself." Morel had always assumed that was just something old women said to keep children from playing too close to the trees after dark. She was still holding her rake 9 weeks before the drill broke bedrock, standing at the crest of the hill, when the assembly skimmer came down out of a cloudless sky and landed close enough to blow dust across 3 graves she'd just cleared. The being who stepped out of it was tall in the way Thren always were, jointed wrong by human standards, skin like polished slate, threaded with faint lines of blue light that pulsed slower when they were calm and faster when they weren't. This one's lines were pulsing fast. Morel didn't know yet that his name was Vesco, or that he'd spent 11 years cataloguing dead colonies for the Assembly's Continuance Office and had never once seen a species bury its people in open ground and simply leave them there. Unrecorded, unlinked, alone. "You are the keeper of this site," he said. It wasn't a question. The Thren didn't usually bother with those. "I'm the groundskeeper," Morel said. "There's a difference, but most people don't care." "I care," Vesco said, and something in the way he said it made her lower the rake. "I had been sent to conduct an inventory. Before that happens, I would like you to explain something to me. 211 of your dead are on this hill. Your species has had for 90 years the means to reduce biomass to usable compound, to record neural pattern data before decomposition, to convert this entire hillside into productive land. Instead, you dig a hole and you put a person in it, and you leave them there to become nothing. Why?" Morel looked at him for a long moment. She'd answered versions of this question before, from tourists, from surveyors, even once from a Thren linguist who'd meant it kindly. She'd never quite found an answer that satisfied the people asking it, because she was starting to suspect it wasn't actually a question you could answer with words. But she tried anyway, because that was the job. They don't become nothing, she said. They become the ground we grow the rest of our lives on. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. Vesco's lights pulsed, considering, unconvinced. That is a metaphor. I asked for a reason. That was the reason, Morelli said, and picked her rake back up, because the twin suns were climbing and the grave still needed clearing, and she had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that this conversation was the beginning of something much larger than one alien's curiosity. She was right. 6 days later, the colony's public hall was full for the first time since the Harvest Festival, and nobody in the room looked like they were there to celebrate anything. Director Carl Bresch stood at the front, another Thren, older than Vesco by the look of her dimmer, steadier lights, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. She was the Assembly's regional development overseer for this sector, which meant her job was quotas, and her quotas were 3 years behind, and everyone in the room already knew, before she opened her mouth, that whatever she was about to say involved the hill. DeepScan's survey has confirmed a vetlit mineral seam directly beneath the colony's northern burial ground, she said. Vetlit is required for the relay array this sector needs to extend Assembly defense coverage against raider incursions from the fray. Without it, this colony and 11 others remain outside protected space indefinitely. The Assembly is prepared to relocate all 211 interments to a new site with full ceremonial honor at Assembly expense within 1 month. There was a silence in the hall you could have cut into pieces and sold. "You want to dig up our dead," said someone near the back, "to build an antenna? I want to protect 11 colonies from raiders who have already killed 40,000 people this decade," Bresch said, without heat, which somehow made it worse. "I understand this is a sensitive matter for your culture. I am prepared to be generous about the timeline." "You're not moving them," Morelli said. She hadn't planned to speak. She stood up anyway. "Not the graves. Not one of them." Bresch's lights flickered, the Thren equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "You are the groundskeeper. I am. Then you, more than anyone in this room, should understand that this is not a cathedral. It is soil with organic matter buried in it. We are offering to relocate that soil with more ceremony than your own species typically manages. I do not understand the resistance." "That's the problem," Morel said. "You don't." She sat back down before she said something that would make this worse, but the room was already on its feet around her, and for the first time in 90 years, Solace Colony was arguing about its own dead. It didn't stay an argument for long. 2 weeks after the meeting, survey stakes went up along the base of the hill, and the first heavy transport rolled in from orbit, and that was when the colony did something nobody, least of all Vesco, had predicted. They didn't riot. They didn't sabotage the equipment. They didn't even shout. They just showed up. At dawn, on the day the site crew planned to break ground, they found 400 people standing shoulder to shoulder around the base of the hill, silent, unarmed, unmoving, farmers in mechanics and children, and the colony's one aging doctor. And Murray at the front of them with her rake still in her hand, because she genuinely hadn't thought to put it down. Vesco watched it from the skimmer's open hatch, and something about it unsettled him more than any protest speech could have. He was used to resistance being loud. This was not loud. It didn't ask to be negotiated with. It simply existed, patiently, the way the hill itself existed, and it made it very clear that moving equipment through it would require moving 400 human bodies first, one at a time. and that every single one of them had already decided that was an acceptable price. They will disperse once the heat rises, Bresh said over the comm, from her office 200 kilometers away. Human physiology does not tolerate standing exposure well. She was wrong. By midday, more people had arrived, not fewer. Off-shift workers, people from the neighboring settlement 40 kilometers south, who'd heard over the local band and simply started walking. Nobody organized it. Nobody needed to. This is not sustainable behavior, Bresh said, later, when the crew finally withdrew for the day without breaking ground. It's not supposed to be sustainable, Feshko said, surprising himself. It's supposed to be enough, for as long as it takes. Bresh's lights went very still, the look of someone recalculating a problem she'd thought was simple. You sound sympathetic, ordered her. I am curious, Vesco said, which was not quite a denial. 211 strangers, most of them dead before this generation was born, and 400 living people will stand in the sun for them without being asked. I have never seen a species do that for information it doesn't even store. It is not information, Bresh said. That is precisely the inefficiency I am trying to correct. He didn't argue with her. But that night, alone in his quarters, Beshko pulled the colony's original founding records, thin, incomplete, half corrupted from a fire in the archive building 60 years back, and started reading everything Solace had ever bothered to write down about that first stone at the top of the hill. He found almost nothing. First, he stayed. A name that appeared once in a crew manifest and nowhere else. Elias Vance, propulsion engineer, colony ship Meridian. Cause of death, unrecorded. And a note, handwritten, added decades later, by someone in the colony's second generation, that read only, ground unbroken by order of the first commander, reason known to the keepers. He went to find Morel the next morning. She wasn't hard to find. She was exactly where she always was, kneeling at the top of the hill in front of the first stone, and this time she didn't stand up when he approached. You knew I'd come back, she said. I read your records. What little of them exist. I found a phrase I do not understand. Reason known to the keepers. You are a keeper. What is the reason? Muriel was quiet for a long moment, tracing the worn spiral at the base of the stone with one finger, the way Vesco realized, watching her, that she had probably done 10,000 times before, without ever fully understanding it herself. My great-grandmother told my grandmother, who told my mother, who told me, she said. Not the whole story, pieces. She said the man in this grave died protecting something the size of a child, and that whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't the colonists who buried him alone. She said something came down out of the caves that first winter and helped dig the hole, and that the commander made a promise to it, out loud, with the whole crew watching, and that as long as this ground stayed unbroken, the promise stayed kept. She said we were never supposed to need the details. We were just supposed to keep the ground. You believe there was another species here, before assembly contact, before anyone catalogued this world. I believe there's a reason nothing on this planet has ever come down that ridge to kill us in 90 years, Muriel said, when everything else on Solace wants to. I believe the wildlife surveys the assembly ran when we joined up somehow never found a single sapient species on a planet humans have been quietly protected on for 9 decades. And I think that's either the worst survey in galactic history or the animals here have been told to leave this hill alone. I don't know which. I've never known which. My family just knew what happens if you break the ground to find out. Vesco looked down at the stone for a long time, at the spiral pattern he had, until that moment assumed was simple erosion. Director Bresh has scheduled full excavation in 11 days, he said quietly. She believes this is superstition. Sentiment without evidentiary basis. I am required to certify the site is clear before drilling begins. Are you going to? I do not know, Vesco said, and it was the first true thing he had said to a human since arriving on Solace. He tried to stop it anyway. He brought Mirel's account to Bresh the next day, carefully, formally, exactly the way continuance office protocol required unverified cultural claims to be filed. Bresh listened to the entire report without her lights so much as flickering. An oral tradition, she said, when he finished. 3 generations of retelling, no physical evidence, no corroborating record, offered by the one person on this colony with the strongest personal incentive to prevent excavation. Auditor, I understand you have formed an attachment to this population. I do not fault you for it. But I have 11 colonies in the radar incursion timeline that does not care about a story a grandmother told her granddaughter. The wildlife pattern is documented, Vesco said. 90 years without a single recorded predator incursion onto that hill, on a planet where predator incursion is the leading cause of colonist death everywhere else. That is anomalous. It deserves investigation before, it deserves a footnote, Bresh said, which I will happily include in the final report. Drilling proceeds in 11 days, Auditor. I would remind you that your role here is to certify, not to obstruct. The 11 days went quickly, the way time does when everyone involved can feel something ending. Mirel kept clearing the graves every morning. The colonists kept their silent vigil at the base of the hill, in shifts now, day and night, because word had spread, and the crowd had, if anything, grown. Bresh brought in a second excavation crew and a security detail from the regional garrison, quietly, without announcement, and Vesco watched that happen and understood exactly what it meant. 2 nights before the scheduled excavation, he went back up the hill one final time and found Morel sitting beside the first grave in the dark, not working, just sitting. The way he'd come to understand humans did when there was nothing left to do with their hands. There's a security detail coming with the crew, he told her. Bresh is expecting a vigil to hold its position. She intends to clear it, physically, if necessary. I know, Morel said. Captain Reyes told us this afternoon. He's the one who'll be giving that order. Will your people move? No. Then people will be hurt. Possibly you. Morel looked up at him, and in the low light of Solace's smaller moon, Vesco saw something in her face that he had catalogued 1,000 times in 1,000 species, and never once, until this moment, fully understood. Not defiance, not fear, but a kind of settled calm that came from having already decided what a thing was worth. You asked me once why we bury our dead instead of turning them into something useful, she said. I want to tell you something my grandmother never explained, because I only figured it out tonight, sitting here. It's not that the ground is more useful this way. It isn't. Your director is right about that. It's that some promises only mean something if they cost you something to keep. If it was easy, if it was efficient, if there was nothing at stake, it wouldn't be a promise, it'd just be a policy. And policies get revised the second they're inconvenient. That's exactly what's happening to yours right now. Vesco had no answer for that. He left the hill that night more uncertain than he had been in 11 years of service to the continuance office, and he did not sleep. The drill reached bedrock at 17 minutes past 4 in the morning. Bresh had ordered the excavation to begin before dawn, quietly, hoping to break ground before the day shift of the vigil arrived to reinforce the night shift. Captain Reyes moved his security line up the base of the hill an hour before first light, and the 200 or so colonists holding the night vigil rose to meet them without a word, locking arms, and for one terrible, suspended minute, it looked as though 90 years of an unbroken promise was going to end in a security line and a stretcher. Then the drill hit the marker stone, and the ground answered. The voice came through every open channel on the planet, colony band, assembly band, security band, all of it, because the transmitter Elias Fence had built into that stone with his own dying hands 90 years earlier had been engineered, in the final desperate hours of his life, to broadcast on every frequency his ship's dying systems could reach, because he'd had no way of knowing which frequencies whoever found him would still be using. Don't move him. I gave my word. Static. Then, after 3 full seconds that felt like 3 hours, the recording caught, stabilized, and kept going, and Elias Vance's voice, young, exhausted, bleeding out somewhere in the recording, but steady, filled the sky above Solace. He told them about the crash, about the reactor housing cracking on impact and venting coolant radiation into a cave system nobody on the Meridian's crew had known was inhabited. He told them about the things that came out of that cave, silent, crystalline, small as children, terrified, and about the moment he'd realized the radiation leak was going to kill every one of them within the hour if somebody didn't get between the vent and the cave mouth. He told them, in a voice that cracked once and then didn't crack again, that he wasn't a hero, that he was just the only one close enough, and that he'd do it again. He told them what happened after, that the crystalline things, he called them the quiet ones, because he'd never learned what they called themselves, had come out of the cave that night while the surviving crew dug his grave, and had brought stones, one at a time, each one carrying a single stone in limbs that weren't quite hands, and set them at the base of the marker, and stayed until the burial was finished. That the colony's first commander, a woman named Ardies Osei, had stood over that grave and made a promise to creatures who couldn't speak human language and might not have understood a word of it, that this ground would never be broken. Not for mining, not for building, not for anything, as long as any human remained on Solace to keep the promise, and that the quiet ones had, somehow, understood enough. Because for 90 years, nothing had ever come down off that ridge to hurt them. I don't know if you're the crew who's listening to this, Elias's recording said, near the end, his voice fading, as the last of the power drained out of a battery 90 years overdue to die. I don't know if it's been a year or 100. But if you're standing on this hill and thinking about digging, don't. Not because I'm owed anything. I'm not. I did what anybody would have done if they were close enough. Do it because somebody promised something to somebody who couldn't ask for it back. And if we break that just because it's inconvenient now, then it was never really a promise. It was just a thing we said until it cost us something. The recording ended in static. The ground did not stay silent for long. It started as a tremor, low enough that most people mistook it for the drill still running, until someone shut the drill down, and the tremor kept going. Then the hillside itself seemed to shift, not collapsing, but opening. Dozens of narrow fissures along the base of the ridge that Mireille realized, with a jolt that stopped her breath, had probably been there the entire time, hidden under root systems and 90 years of undisturbed soil. The quiet ones came up out of the ground the way light comes up over a horizon, not fast, not aggressive, simply present, one moment absent and the next simply there, dozens of them, crystalline, faintly luminous, standing at heights that ranged from a child's to nearly Vesco's own, moving with a silence that made every human weapon in Captain Reyes's security line feel sumly, desperately loud by comparison. Hold your position. Gresh's voice crackled over the security channel, tight and fast in a way Vesco had never heard from her before. Defensive posture. Do not engage unless... Belay that, Captain Reyes said. It was, as far as Vesco later learned, the first order Reyes had ever refused in 11 years of assembly service. He said it once, clearly, and then he lowered his own weapon and stepped out of the security line entirely, and after a moment that felt like it lasted a geological age, the rest of his detail did the same. Bresh's voice came back sharper. Captain, that is a direct order from a regional overseer. You will. With respect, Director Reyes said. There are people standing right in front of me who just found out the thing they've been protecting their whole lives is real, and I am not going to be the reason it dies for it. Morel didn't wait to see how the standoff would resolve. She walked forward, past the security line, past Rares, up the last stretch of hillside toward the nearest of the quiet ones, unarmed, empty-handed, her heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. And she stopped an arm's length away and did the only thing she could think to do. She knelt down at the level of the smallest one, the way you'd kneel to a frightened child, and she said, out loud, to a creature that had never heard a human voice in 90 years, "We kept it. I promise you, we kept it. I'm sorry it took this long for you to have to check." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the smallest of the quiet ones reached out with a limb that caught the morning light like cut glass and set something small and cold into her open palm. It was a stone, worn smooth, carried, she understood suddenly, for 90 years, waiting for someone to finally be there to receive it. Fresh arrived on site 40 minutes later, by which point the drilling equipment had been fully withdrawn. The vigil had broken not in retreat, but in a slow, stunned unraveling into conversation. And Vesco was standing at the crest of the hill, watching 200 humans and several dozen crystalline strangers regard each other across a boundary that 90 years of silence had somehow, impossibly, kept safe. She took in the scene with her lights pulsing in a pattern Vesco had never seen on her before. Something close to what a human might have called shame, though she would never have used that word herself. She said, quietly, to no one in particular. "No," Vesco agreed, "but I would ask you to consider what auditor's discretion actually means, to know deeper, because of what auditor's discretion actually means." Quote, "It took 3 more days to learn that the quiet ones, who introduced themselves, eventually, through a translation framework built painstakingly by the colony's linguist and one patient, extraordinarily old individual who seemed to serve as something like a memory keeper for her own people, had known about the Vattelite seam the entire time. They had simply never had a reason to mention it, because nobody had ever asked them anything in 90 years except to leave. There was a far larger one 11 kilometers north, deep enough to avoid every inhabited cave system on the planet, which the quiet ones were, once actually consulted, entirely willing to show the assembly survey teams themselves. The relay array got built, the 11 colonies got their defense coverage. Nobody had to move a single stone on the hill to make it happen. 6 months later, the Assembly Continuance Council, after reviewing Ilias Vance's recording, the wildlife anomaly data, and a report filed under Vesco's name that ran to 11,000 words and ended, unusually for continuance office documentation, with a personal recommendation rather than a summary, passed an amendment to frontier development law. Any site on any world where a formal promise had been made to an indigenous population, witnessed and unbroken, would receive automatic protected status under Assembly Charter, regardless of resource value. They called it, in the dry language of Assembly legislation, the Solace provision. Nobody in the room that voted on it had ever met Ilias Vance. Several of them cried, anyway, in whatever way their species cried. Vesco stayed on Solace another year after that, technically still cataloguing, though he'd stopped filing much of anything. He spent most of his time at the top of the hill, where Mirelle had started keeping a second stone beside the first, the one the smallest of the quiet ones had given her, which she'd never been able to bring herself to put anywhere else. "I still do not fully understand it," he admitted to her one evening, watching the twin suns go down behind the ridge, the quiet ones' luminous shapes beginning to gather at the tree line, the way they now did most evenings, close enough to be near, far enough to still be their own. My people store memory in lattice. It does not decay. It does not require faith. It is simply retrieved, whole, forever. And yet you have kept something for 90 years that we could not have kept at all, because the moment it stopped being convenient, we would have simply revised the record. That's the part you keep missing, Morel said. It's not that we're better at remembering, we're worse at it. We forget almost everything, eventually. That's exactly why the things we refuse to forget mean something. You can't promise something you're incapable of breaking. We can break this, easily, any day we want, we just don't. Vesco looked down at the two stones, side by side in the fading light, and for the first time in his very long life, understood that he had come to a planet to audit a resource and found something his own species had no lattice deep enough to store. The assembly had asked why humans still buried their dead, instead of letting the past dissolve into data. 90 years later, the ground had finally answered them, and the answer was simple enough to fit on a single, hand-carved stone. A promise buried is still a promise kept.